Hello, hello. So, you may be wondering, what is this guy? And why is he here? Well, that is because today on Behavior Cross History, we're going to jump back in after a little break, and where we are jumping into is Western Australia in 1932. We're going to be looking at the Emu Wars, not to be mistaken with the Emu Wars. At a first glance, it might sound a little bit fictional, but it's actually going to jump into the national military, machine guns, and thousands of these guys flying around. There we go. So, in today's retelling, we're going to be looking at the Emu Wars. Like I mentioned, it seems kind of funny, I think it is anyways, to imagine thousands of very large birds running around fields and attacking people who have tanks and stuff. Anyways, but really what's really kind of cool is when we look at this historical event, there's a lot of opportunities to look at environmental variables, how all living organisms really adapt to how their environments change, and then what happens when interventions that are designed without full understanding of the behavior it hopes to change occur. So before we get started, let's take a look first at some core references that were used for the presentation. When we're looking at references, I often will pull from behavior analytics sources as well as historical documents surrounding the specific event. So the historical background references that I utilized, Burton, 2013, Tell Me Mate, What Were Emus Like, which was published in Frontiers in Ecology and the Environment. Gore, JG, 2016, Looking Back, Australia's Emu Wars. The Sun Herald from 1953, New Strategy in a War on the Emu. And Wikipedia Contributors 2026. Then as well, utilizing behavior analytic resources. Is it Budall? I think it's Budall, but maybe it's Buclaw. The font has thrown me. Buclaw and I'm going to refrain from that name because I do not want to butcher it. 2017, Seasonal and Daily Changes in Behavior of the Adult Emu Under Farm Conditions, which was published in British Poultry Sciences. McGee, H.M. Diner, 2010, Behavior Systems Analysis in Health and Human Services, which was published in Behavior and Social Issues. McGee, H.M. Crowley-Koch, E.J. Hoffman et al., 2019, Using Behavioral Systems Analysis to Improve Large-Scale Change in Health and Human Services, Perspectives on Behavior Science. Menon, Bennett, and Chang, 2014, Understanding the Behavior of Domestic Emus. And Menon, Bennett, Chang. Oh wait, I just said that one. And Padokar, Rayan, Shajal, and Belkair. If I butchered your name, I'm very sorry. 2009, Behavior of Emu Bird. Dromaeus Novohollande. Veterinary World. So just some educational disclaimers. This is all publicly documented history, and none of this is used for diagnoses or formal behavior assessment or even clinical treatment recommendation. It's all interpretations that are hypothesized by me. And I am a human. I am a board certified behavior analyst, but I am not your bird. I'm not your bird certified behavior analyst. Bird certified behavior analyst. And essentially, all of this is from our historical data that has been allotted to us. Learning objectives and how we are aligning these with the, the BCBA competency alignment. So at the end of this course, if you're watching on Spotify or YouTube, super cool. You don't have to take the course that goes along with it, but if you're a behavior analyst, you're looking for some CEUs, you can complete the CEU assessment on my website, behavioracrosshistory.com. If you go to the CEU tab, it'll have the Emu Wars listed as one of your options to utilize. This is free course. I find it fun to jump on a time machine and dig into some history. But I know some people want CEUs, right? So if you want to get a CEU, go over there, pay for it, blah, blah, blah. If you're otherwise not and you just want to hang out, cool, free. So upon completion of this course, participants will be able to describe historical events and environmental conditions that contributed to the Great Emu War, identify how antecedent environmental variables influenced both human and animal behavior throughout the conflict, explain the role of environmental selection in shaping behavioral outcomes. I'm going to move my camera so I'm not over that. Describe how changes to environmental contingencies may be more effective than increasing response effort or intensity. Apply concepts from behavioral systems analysis, otherwise known as BSA, and organizational behavior management, otherwise known as OBM, to a historical case. We're going to, or rather, you shall be able to summarize findings from contemporary behavior analytic research related to environmental arrangement and animal behavior, as well as discuss how behavior analysts can apply systems thinking to modern organizational and clinical practice. And now, a retelling of events. All right, so let's get to it. The First World War had ended more than a decade earlier, and across Australia, returning veterans were attempting to rebuild their lives. To reward their service and to stimulate agricultural production, the Australian government offered many veterans parcels of land in Western Australia. The expectation was simple: cultivate the land, grow the wheat, and help strengthen the nation's economy. However, instead, many found themselves battling harsh weather, poor soil, falling wheat prices that were brought on by the Great Depression, and the daily uncertainty that accompanies farming. Then another challenge arrived. Each year, after breeding season, thousands of emus would migrate inland in search of food and water. Standing nearly 6 feet tall and capable of running over 30 miles per hour, the birds traveled in enormous flocks across the Australian landscape. In 1932, many of those flocks discovered something far more appealing than their native vegetation: freshly planted wheat. And I imagine they sounded something like this. Wheat! That's what that guy's saying right there. Now, for the farmers, the sight was rather devastating. Essentially, for instance, one contemporary newspaper described the fields covered by hundreds upon hundreds of emus feeding across the crops. Another reported that the birds crashed through fencing as they moved, leaving gaps large enough for rabbits to enter behind them. What began as crop damage quickly became an entirely new agricultural problem. For families who were already struggling through economic hardship after the Great Depression and after the hardship of war, every acre mattered. Letters and petitions began arriving at government offices, and farmers explained that months of work were disappearing in only a matter of days. Traditional methods of driving away the birds had very little effect. Pressure was mounting insurmountably, and eventually the government decided to intervene. But rather than sending additional agricultural workers or expanding fencing programs, officials approved an unusual request. Major G.P.W. Meredith of the Royal Australian Artillery was ordered to Western Australia with 2 Lewis machine guns and approximately 10,000 rounds of ammunition. The expectation seemed reasonable. A small military detachment, armed with automatic weapons, really should have little difficulty confronting a population of large flightless birds. In early November, the campaign began. The soldiers soon located a large flock, and according to contemporary reports, they waited patiently as the birds approached, allowing them to gather before suddenly opening fire. Then everything changed. The first burst of gunfire echoed across the wheat fields. Almost instantly, the flock dissolved. Rather than remaining together, the emus scattered into dozens of smaller groups, sprinting across uneven terrain in every direction, and dust started rising and flowing behind them as hundreds of birds disappeared across fields before soldiers could effectively reposition their weapons. When the shooting stopped, only a handful of birds had been killed. Yet the operation continued. Again and again, soldiers attempted to anticipate the birds' movements. Again and again, the emus refused to behave as expected. Machine guns occasionally jammed, vehicles struggled across rough ground, and large flocks separated before concentrated fire could be maintained. Some contemporary reports noted that even the birds that had been wounded continued running remarkable distances, making recovery for the soldiers very difficult. As the days passed, Major Meredith found himself describing an opponent unlike any he had ever anticipated. He had observed that once the firing began, the birds broke into smaller groups that became exceptionally difficult to track. He even remarked that some emus appeared to act almost like sentries, remaining alert while others fed before signaling the flock to move. Whether this reflected organizational behavior, doubt, or simply Meredith's interpretation of what he observed, it captured just how unpredictable the operation had become. After several unsuccessful engagements, Meredith offered the remark that history would remember. If we had... This is what I envision him sounding like, right? Well, maybe not. If we had a military division with bullet-carrying capacity of these birds, it would face any army in the world. The statement was delivered with humor, however, it really reflected the genuine, a little bit of genuine respect to the efforts of the birds. The military had expected the birds to conform to the plan that they had, the military, but instead the plan had forced the plan had been forced to respond to the birds. Australian newspapers quickly embraced the irony, and the campaign began to be known as the Emu War. Articles joked that the military was facing an enemy that simply refused to cooperate. Reports described birds disappearing over the horizon before another burst could be fired. What had begun as a serious government response was becoming a national curiosity. Back on the farms, however, there was very little humor. The birds continued feeding, the fences still required repair, and the wheat was disappearing. The farmers who had requested help remained in the same fields where they had started, searching for ways to protect the livelihoods they had spent years building. Within weeks, the military operation ended, and fewer and fewer emus had been eliminated than the officials had anticipated, and the campaign was judged as an inefficient use of government resources. In the years that followed, Australia relied far more heavily on exclusion fencing, organized culling programs. I don't know how I feel about that, but then look at the other side of things. And agricultural management rather than military intervention. Ironically, those environmental changes proved considerably more effective than machine guns. Today, the Emu War is recognized as one of history's strangest military campaigns. It is often summarized with a single joke. The emus won. But viewed through another lens, the conclusion misses the most important lesson. The birds did not defeat the military through strategy. They simply continued behaving in ways that had been shaped by their biology and their environment. It was the intervention, not the birds, that failed to account for those variables. And that is precisely where our behavior analysis is going to begin. All right. Look at that guy. Isn't that a handsome emu? That's so handsome. All right, anywho, at first glance, the Emu War really is a rather amusing story. A military forced with armies and machine guns failed to stop a flock of these big dudes, right? And history remembers these guys, these handsome fellas, as winning the war, right? It's easy to laugh at the headlines. However, if we strip away the humor and examine the event through a behavior analytic lens, something much more interesting emerges. This wasn't simply a story about birds. It was a story about multiple organisms, each behaving in ways that made sense within the contingencies of their own environments and histories. So first, let's dig in a little bit to the emus. From the perspective of the birds, nothing unusual was likely happening. Each year, the emus migrated across Western Australia in search of food and water, and migration was already a part of their behavioral repertoire. It was shaped by both evolutionary selection and the consequences that those movements had historically produced. Over generations, the birds that successfully located their food and water survived and reproduced. And within an individual's lifetime, successful foraging continued to strengthen the patterns of movement towards reliable resources. Enter humans, who dramatically altered the environment. Thousands of acres of cultivated wheat appeared across the landscape, and compared to searching miles of scrubland for scattered vegetation, these fields really represented an extraordinarily rich source of reinforcement. Food was concentrated, it was abundant, it was predictable, and it required far less effort to maintain, or rather, obtain. Now, from a behavior analytic perspective, entering those wheat fields reliably contacted reinforcement, right? The consequence of entering that wheat field, access to food, increased the likelihood that similar patterns of movement would occur again under similar environmental conditions. You know, it really isn't speculative when we look at this. It's hypothesized, of course. However, when we research, there has been research examining emu behavior that has consistently demonstrated that their activity changes in response to environmental conditions rather than remaining rigid or stereotyped. In a study of domestic emus by M.Ed and colleagues from 2014, they actually found that feeding, locomotion, resting, vigilance, and social behaviors varied systematically with environmental variables such as temperature, time of day, and resource availability. All stimuli within their environment, right? And the authors of this study actually concluded that emu behavior is highly responsive to changing environmental conditions, a finding that aligns remarkably well with what observers described during the Emu War. Now, of course, no one taught the birds to seek out the wheat fields. No one, as far as I'm aware, ran up to them and said, hey, look over here. That's where you're going to get something yummy, right? There was no planning on their end. There was no, these guys were not running around in hard hats. Well, they weren't doing construction. Well, they also were not wearing war helmets, right? And there was like no military strategy, you know, unless you want to like personify these guys in your head to have a more fun depiction of what may have gone on, but it didn't happen, you know? But the environment itself really reinforced their behavior. Now imagine these beautiful big guys running free in the fields, and all of a sudden the military arrives. The first burst of machine gun fire introduced a very new environmental variable, and there was novelty within their environment. Did the birds stop behaving? No. The novelty really created an opportunity for their behavior to change. Large flocks began to disperse into smaller groups. Individuals altered their paths of travel, and the birds continued moving towards reinforcement, but they did so differently than what they previously would have, and there was a behavior contrast between their prior behaviors and newer behaviors because that environment that they were in had changed. So, you know, as analysts, we often will describe behavior as being dynamic rather than fixed. It does not occur in a vacuum. It occurs in the real world. And when environmental conditions change, behaviors change. And that principle was unfolding all across the wheat fields of Western Australia. You know, this really illustrates for us some response variability. When a previously successful pattern of behavior encounters disruption, organisms frequently will begin varying their responses to that environment. Some variations are ineffective and others prove more successful, but those successful variations are then differentially selected by the environment and subsequently reinforced or put on punishment. Now, whether we're discussing wildlife, children learning communication skills, or employees adapting to new workplace procedures, response variability is often the pathway through which more effective behavior emerges. The emus did not stop seeking food. They varied how they sought it. And even research on wild emus supports this interpretation as well. So Neild and colleagues studied emu movement ecology and described the species as highly mobile, capable, or mobile, whichever you prefer, whatever tickles your fancy. Described the emu species as really highly mobile, capable of adjusting movement patterns over large distances as environmental conditions and resource availability change. Rather than repeatedly following identical routes, emus alter where and how they travel in response to changes in the landscape. So from a behavior analytic perspective, that flexibility is exactly what we would expect from behavior coming under changing environmental control. So similarly, Bucklaw 2017 documented seasonal and daily variations in adult emu behavior and found that there were predictable changes in activity patterns depending on the weather, season, and other environmental conditions. And these findings reinforce a really great lesson that we can see here, which is that what appears to be inconsistent behavior, quote unquote, generally is highly lawful when you view it through the context of the changing antecedent conditions and consequence conditions surrounding the behavior. So take a little shift. Let's think a little second and look at the farmers. Their behavior, in addition to the emus, their behavior also changed over time. Initially, many attempted traditional methods of protecting their crops. They repaired fences. They attempted to drive away the birds. They relied on methods that may have worked with smaller flocks under different environmental conditions, but when those responses repeatedly failed to produce the desired outcome, new behaviors emerged. The farmers organized. They petitioned government officials. They requested military assistance. Maybe those responses weren't irrational. Maybe they weren't fully rational. But they did represent adaptive attempts to contact reinforcement, which in this case, preserving crops, protecting income, and ensuring their families could continue farming. Now, just like the birds, the farmers weren't responding, or rather the farmers were responding within their own system of reinforcement. As reports of crop destruction increased, so did political pressure. Citizens expected action, right? The government had to demonstrate responsiveness, and deploying the military produced an immediate consequence. It showed that the leaders were doing something, and the intervention changed the appearances long before it changed the environment. Behavior analysts, we may frequently encounter the same phenomena. Organizations may often implement highly visible interventions because visible action itself may contact reinforcement, public approval, rule-governed behavior, reduce complaints, and the appearance of a decisive leadership, looking as though you're doing something, regardless of what that doing something may be. But the interventions that look impressive are not necessarily interventions that alter the contingencies, which are maintaining behaviors. In this situation, the Australian military provides another excellent example, right? The soldiers were given clear instructions: locate the birds, reduce the bird population. That guy's screaming, "Not me!" Protect the farms. Yet performance never occurs in isolation, right? The environment is critical. There were machine guns. Some jammed, some didn't. Vehicles struggled across the rough terrain. And the birds, instead of like the birds all beelining towards the machine guns, of course, they hear machine guns, they go, "Blah!" and they go everywhere. And success really became increasingly difficult, not because of the soldiers lacking motivation or effort, but rather because the environment just really put a constraint on effective responding. And if you happen to ever work or currently work or ever have worked in organizational behavior management, this might feel a little bit familiar. When employees struggle, organizations often attribute poor performance to motivation, lack thereof, attitude, or effort. But we as analysts looking at this from the outside might say, what features of the environment are making successful performance more or less likely? The Emu War reminds us that behavior cannot be separated from the context in which it occurs. Perhaps the most important lesson, however, will come from examining the system as a whole, right? Nothing happens in a vacuum. Nothing happens in isolation, right? None of these participants existed independently. The farmers' behavior influenced the politicians, political decisions altered military behavior, and military action changed the birds' immediate environment. And the birds' responses altered the public perception and political decision-making, and each participant became a part of a large network of interlocking contingencies. So no single individual produced the outcome remembered as the Emu War. Rather, the outcome emerged from the interaction of many individuals responding to one another over time. From a systems perspective, this is exactly how organizations function, right? Schools, hospitals, group homes, day programs, residential facilities, businesses. Human behavior does not occur in isolation. Instead, individual contingencies interact with organizational contingencies, producing outcomes that no single participant created independently. Now, coffee is needed. So when we look at the way the situation eventually was solved, eventually the military campaign ended. The problem itself did not disappear, but what ultimately proved effective was, rather than having something reactionary like machine guns on the ground fighting these big boys, rather than that, it was better to have antecedent manipulations. Things on the front end, stronger exclusion fencing, improved agricultural management, and changes that really reduced the birds' access to the reinforcement of the wheat. In other words, the most successful intervention wasn't increasing force, it was changing the environment, which is something that we as analysts have always recognized. Well, I won't say always, but, hopefully often recognize, the most success wasn't increasing force, changing in the environment. And one of the most effective ways to change behavior is not attempting to overpower it, be reactionary, but by arranging an environment in a way that's thoughtful so that the contingencies surrounding the behavior support the environment and the ideal outcomes of that environment. Now, as analysts, we encounter modern versions of this Emu War every day. We don't got those cutie pies running around screaming their heads off, but a school may respond to challenging behavior by increasing punishment without identifying the variables that are actually maintaining that behavior. Healthcare organizations may add policy after policy while staff performance remains unchanged. A supervisor increases oversight when the real problem lies in insufficient training, poorly arranged reinforcement, or barriers within the work environment. The intervention becomes larger, but the contingencies remain the same. History shows us that larger interventions are not necessarily better interventions. And as analysts, we like to look, and before we ask how to change the behavior, we want to identify first why. What is the function of that behavior? Because once we identify the function and the contingencies, the solution often becomes far more simple, more humane, more effective than simply being reactionary. Now, with this understanding, let's look at how some behavior analysts who have formally studied these same principles through behavior systems analysis and research on the environmental control of behavior and some of the things that they have found, right? Okay, so we're going to look at a couple articles and then we're going to do a little bit of a deep dive into some journal reviews. We really have been looking at why interventions that appeared so powerful failed to solve problems at hand. And the answer may seem obvious in hindsight, but, behavioral systems analysis can really help us kind of dissect some of this information. So we're going to look at McGee, Crowley, Koch, Daly, Hoffman, et al. 2019 Behavior Systems Analysis in Health and Human Services Settings. This paper focused primarily on health and human service organizations rather than agriculture or wildlife management. The principles it describes apply very well to what we just explored. The reason why the article was written was because the authors recognized that behavior analysts are exceptionally skilled at changing individual behavior. However, many problems that organizations face can't be solved by changing one person's behavior. Instead, the behaviors and the problems that may arise may emerge from interactions between and among people, departments, procedures, and environmental variables. So the purpose was to really be able to demonstrate how behavior systems analysis could be used to understand and improve complex organizational performance. So what is BSA? What is behavior systems? Blah, 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 blah. What is behavioral systems analysis? So it basically, like, think about when you're looking on Google Maps, Google Maps, when you're looking at Google Maps and you zoom in and you zoom out, right? It allows us to really zoom out rather than focusing exclusively on one person's behavior. We're looking at the entire system. Think about that guy. I forget what show it's from. I don't know what show it's from, but he's standing in front of a board and he's got all these little red lines everywhere and he looks like a crazy person. So that's essentially what we do. We want to look at the entire system, how one person's behavior influences another, what environmental variables are shaping performance, where are the breakdowns occurring, and how do these consequences in one part of the system create problems elsewhere in the system? So instead of asking who made the mistake, we're asking what characteristics of the system produce this outcome and where are all these red lines coming from, right? Some of the methods within the article, rather than this being a single experimental study, the paper served as a practical review and framework of applying behavior systems analysis across health and human service settings. So the authors summarize existing behavior systems methodologies and demonstrate how practitioners can identify organizational problems, analyze interlocking contingencies, and design interventions that then would improve system-wide outcomes. Some of the key findings that they found. One of the paper's central messages is that organizational problems rarely exist in isolation. We know this. Performance is affected by multiple interacting variables. Changing one person's behavior often produces little improvement if the surrounding system continues to support the existing pattern of behavior and contingencies. So the authors emphasized identifying the very importance of identifying inputs entering the system, processes occurring within the system, outputs produced by the system, and feedback loops that maintain or alter performance. So this broader perspective helps practitioners identify why organizations continue producing outcomes that nobody actually wants. If the emu were here, he'd say, right? Now, the Emu War becomes much more understandable when viewed through this system's perspective. Initially, it's like a soldier fighting and eliminating birds story, and really, BSA tells us a different story. Farmers responded appropriately to crop damage. Government officials responded appropriately to public pressure. Military personnel followed the directions they were given. The emus responded to changes in food availability. These big boys were just hungry. They just wanted a snack, a little snicky snack of wheat. And each participant behaved in ways that made sense within their own contingencies. The problem wasn't that individuals failed, just this system produced an ineffective intervention. Military action addressed one component while leaving primary maintaining variables in place, and the availability of the highly reinforcing food sources and environmental conditions supporting migration largely unchanged. The result was predictable. The behavior continued. We may encounter our own Emu Wars far often than we might realize. Supervisor increases monitoring while staff continue making errors. A school adopts a stricter disciplinary procedure while classroom behavior remains unchanged. A residential provider develops increasingly restrictive policies while incidents, continue occurring. Behavioral systems analysis reminds us to, as a human, resist the temptation to blame individuals first. Instead, we ask, what contingencies is the system producing? What variables have we overlooked? How are different parts of the organization influencing one another? And generally, those questions will lead us into solutions that are more effective, more efficient, and more humane. Perhaps the greatest lesson of this article is that lasting behavior change often requires systems change. And that's exactly what history eventually demonstrated in Australia. The solution wasn't stronger weapons or bigger guns, which are weapons. The solution was a better designed environment. And this shall lead us into, we were already there. This is going to lead us into a journal review. I'm going to move myself so you can see the journal reviews that we are going to conduct. So we already reviewed an article, but now we're going to really dig into a journal review. The first one we're looking at is behavioral systems analysis, understanding why systems produce the results that they do, you know? Actually, we were about to do this journal review. We just did that. My brain. Okay, so actually we're going to move into our next journal review. Journal review number 2. Environmental variables and behavioral flexibility in emus. Yeah! This was a study conducted by Menon. Let me see. Oh dear. By Menon, Katak, Chatterjee, Rajkumar in 2014, understanding the behavior of domestic emus. Dromaeus Nova Hollandi, within the Indian Journal of Animal Research. Now, the environmental variables and behavioral flexibility in emus. My brain just farted. My brain just farted. I need more coffee. Anywho, throughout this whole segment, we've really been describing the emus as remarkably adaptable. When the environment changed, their behavior changed, and that might sound like an interpretation of history, but modern research on emu behavior actually does tell us something very similar. So, one thing that, although these researchers were not studying the Emu War itself, they were asking an important question, which was, how does the environment influence emu behavior? An environment, when I say how does the environment, I'm not speaking specifically to any one environment and location, but how in general environmental variables will influence emu behavior. Now, the reason why this study was conducted was because emus had become increasingly important to agricultural settings around the world. To improve the welfare and the management of everyone involved, researchers really sought to better understand their natural behavioral repertoire. So rather than assuming emus behave the same across situations, the researchers wanted to identify how environmental conditions would influence their daily activities. So the methods that the investigators within this study conducted were observing domestic emus over extended periods of time. So they recorded a variety of behaviors such as feeding, walking, locomotion, resting, vigilance, social interactions, comfort behaviors. And these observations occurred across different times of day and occurred under varying environmental conditions. Some of their findings were that the emu behavior is highly responsive to the environment. Feeding behavior changed throughout the day. Locomotion varied with the environmental conditions, and periods of vigilance increased or decreased depending on the surrounding variables. Resting patterns shifted with temperature and other ecological influences. And really, in other words, emu behavior was lawful. It wasn't random. It was sensitive to changing antecedents and consequences, which connects to the findings, which connects these findings to the behaviors observed in the Emu War. So if we think back to the military campaign, when the machine guns were introduced, the birds didn't stop moving. They altered how they moved. They dispersed. They changed routes. You know, that's what they were doing as they were flocking away from those machine guns. They continued seeking food while avoiding the newly introduced threats. Modern behavioral research suggests that this flexibility is precisely what we might expect, but also what was observed. The environment changed, their behavior changed, and from a behavior analytic perspective, it's not necessarily evidence that the birds were outsmarting the military, just that, or rather in a very cognizant way, it's just evidence that the behavior came under control of new environmental variables, while the original source of reinforcement, the wheat, remained available. So one lesson from the study really extends well beyond wildlife, even though they were looking particularly at emus. Behavior analysts frequently work with individuals whose behavior appears inconsistent. One day a skill is demonstrated beautifully, the next day there seems to be spontaneous shifts in that behavior. However, a challenging behavior occurring in one setting, but potentially not another, and a treatment may work in one setting with one therapist but not with another therapist. And rather than asking why is this person being inconsistent, we look at, okay, what changed in the environment? The emus remind us that behavior is not fixed, it is dynamic, and you are likely going to see behavior contrast where behavior changes as environments changed. And so when we understand that relationship between behavior change, environmental variables, our interventions can become less reactive and far more effective. And perhaps the greatest lesson of this really fun event in history is that the environment is always teaching. Whether we like what it's teaching or not, it is always teaching. The question truly becomes whether the people designing the interventions were paying attention. As for these lovely guys, my fantastic friend in the background, they most certainly were paying attention. These wily little emus. All right, y'all. Thank you for hanging with me. If you want to subscribe and follow for future history. You can like, subscribe, blah, blah, blah. And if you want to, you already spent all the time, an hour going through this podcast and chilling out. So if you want to also get a CEU, if you're a behavior analyst, you can hit up the Behavior Across History website and lock in and get a CEU out of it. All right. Thanks for hanging.